We are back with Chapter 1, Section 3 notes, and finally, we are talking about civilizations and the beginning of civilization in the world. So, remember that this corresponds with the notes in the textbook, but it is a little different. We're going to go over a couple things a little differently than the book does, and we'll use some class time to kind of even out the differences so that we're all on the same page going forward. Okay, so finally, we're into civilization, and this is, something that we're going to be referring to throughout the rest of this year, because everything else that we study will be civilization. So this is a foundation that you guys are going to need to have so that you can be successful kind of going forward. Okay, the objective here is to talk about the characteristics of civilizations and apply them to modern society and also our prehistoric and ancient world societies. So let's start with just looking at a map. So these are some of the civilizations that we'll be studying this year. Actually, it'll be most of the civilizations up until March, most likely, that we'll be studying: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, and then China. And what do you notice? This is where civilization starts the earliest. And I'm going to just kind of pause here for a second or two to let you think about what might be here. Well, the key thing that these all have in common is that they're all around rivers. Okay, there we go. Rivers. Rivers have a special role to play in the beginnings of civilization. It has to do with the something that rivers do, which is that they flood, and that flooding produces fertile soil, which then creates opportunities for farming, which then starts the cycle that we're going to start talking about today. More food, more people, which should be an oldie but goodie at this point. More food, more people, and then how that translates into jobs and governments and cities and those kinds of things. So let's just dive right into that. Okay, so as more food is produced due to farming and increases in farming, you have more people. Now, eventually, you're going to get to a point where people start tinkering, right? Remember, that's one of the things that humans are really good at is that we kind of keep making things a little bit better as we use them. We think of new ways to use old tools and, mess with things to improve their output. So technology increases, right? So now we're using better tools to farm. Well, if we have better tools to farm, that means that we're also going to have an increase in food supply, right? So you've got more food equals more people equals more jobs, right? We can actually start trading with other people for other goods and services, right? So if I'm farming and I've got all this extra food, maybe I'm not the best house builder and I need a new house. Maybe I can grow some food for this other guy who's better at building houses, and I can give him the food and he can build me the house. So we both get what we want, right? It's what we call bartering. It's a trade. And you see that starting to happen once the population gets big enough where not everyone is going to need to farm. What we call work specialization. Okay? So think about the cycle now. So we have more food due to the invention of farming. We have more food that leads to more people, right? More people leads to an increased technology as people have more time on their hands. They're not spending all their time farming. Okay? That increase in technology leads to more food again, which increases the population, which now we have job specialization. You have jobs where people can just devote their whole day instead of farming. Now they're doing things like maybe they're a tool maker, right? And if your whole day is spent making tools, you're probably going to get better at making tools, right? You're just spending that time making them, you're perfecting them, you're getting better at your craft, right? Practice makes perfect. So now we have specialized workers who are focusing only on one thing, right? Tool making, house building, irrigation digging, right? Trench digging, something that is related to increasing the food supply over the whole kind of group, right? Over the whole village. So All of that is possible because of farming. I told you before that farming is the most important thing that's ever happened in our history, and it is because it allows all of these other things to happen, right? As workers become specialized, they then get focused on the thing that they're doing. They get better at that. That increases technology, which increases the food supply, which increases the population, which means you have more people who are able to do more things because of farming, right? It's this cycle that never stops. It just kind of keeps feeding itself over and over and over again. And eventually, you're going to see a movement away from animism, right? This belief that there are spirits all over the place. And you start seeing people becoming more focused on religion, that there are gods who exist outside of Earth who have power over nature, right? So you're going to start seeing what we will call a religion instead of just a belief structure, okay? And think about it. Religion, who runs religions, right? Priests and priestesses do. Well, if everybody's needing to provide food for them, they can't spend their time devoted to the gods uh, because they have to, provide food for themselves. But now that there's so much food going around, you can actually say, hey, you know what? That guy over there seems to really have a special connection with the forces of nature. Maybe we just give him food and make sure that he keeps us all safe and keeps the crops growing and does everything that we need him to do, right? So again, all of this started because we discovered farming, right? And eventually, once you have organized religions, once you have specialized workers, you start seeing a growth in population that will allow for cities to start to form. And cities are by far the most important thing to a civilization. Okay, it is the number one characteristic. Speaking of characteristics, let's talk about those. All civilizations have 5 characteristics. You can break them down into 5 characteristics. First, as I said, was advanced cities. These are more than just like large areas of land. They have to be a center of trade. There has to be like an avenue or a marketplace or something where people can gather and exchange goods and services. Okay. Cities also need a government, right? As population gets bigger and bigger and bigger, who's keeping the order? Who's maintaining the rules? Who's figuring out what's fair? Well, before then, people would just figure it out themselves. But now it's getting too large. There needs to be people whose job it is to maintain that order, to maintain society, and that is where governments start creeping in. Again, how are they paid? Well, mostly through taxes off of the food that's being provided. Okay. So again, you have people who now can devote their entire lives to things outside of food procurement, right? Getting enough food. They can devote their lives to doing other things, which is this huge step, right? Again, this is the only time that's ever happened, as far as we know, in the universe, that an organism was able to not have to be involved with getting food directly. Directly. Okay, the next characteristic of a civilization is specialized workers. Okay, we already talked about those. People who focus on one job and one job only, right? They become specialized in what they do. The third is complex institutions, right? And when I'm talking about that, I don't mean institutions like buildings, although most of these kind of do have buildings. Complex institutions, I mean social institutions, right? Like a government or an economy, right? A complex economy that is maybe more than just bartering. Maybe there's a way to share the resources that is a little bit equitable. Maybe things all go to the government and then they distribute it out to the people. That's actually how most of the ancient world governments worked. Maybe there's some sort of currency that is being used that is exchanged in place of food and services, right? Complex religions, right? It's more than just a simple belief structure. Maybe there's religious feast days or certain rituals that have to be performed at certain times in order to keep society moving. Okay, so that's complex institutions. The fourth is record keeping. As civilizations start to grow, as populations start expanding, it's hard to keep track of things like who knows what. So if I'm a farmer and I'm supposed to be giving some of my food to the government and then some of my food to the priests and some of my food to the guy who's building my house and some of my food to the guy who's making my tools, that could be a lot to keep track of. So writing becomes an important uh, skill, an important advancement in technology that allows people to write things down so they don't have to remember it all. Writing comes out of necessity, that it just becomes too large to keep track of in your head. So the earliest writing systems really just started as like pictographs, or they're just drawing of what is owed, and they keep track of it that way. And we'll talk more about that in class when we get to the first civilization. But record keeping becomes a hugely important component of civilization. Just out of the necessity, there's too many people to keep track of everything. And if you remember our conversations around prehistory and what needs to happen before history, right? History, what is history? When we have the first written language, which is cuneiform, that actually starts the beginning of history, right? Of actual history. We're no longer prehistory or prehistoric. We're actually now talking about history, ancient history, but history. Okay, and then last but certainly not least is advanced technology, something above than just basic stone tools, right? Maybe there's metalworking. Maybe civilizations start to use other types of materials to make their tools. Maybe they have more advanced plow systems. Maybe they're pulled by animals, or they have an irrigation system that diverts water from the river into a farm that is more than just a trench. That it's actually this whole integrated system that provides water to all these farmlands, right? So something more advanced than just your simple tools. And usually once a civilization starts, they start moving away from stone and start using metals to make their tools and their weapons, and that is what we'll call the beginning of the Bronze Age. Okay, so those 5 characteristics are extremely important for you to know. You're going to need to know what they are. You're going to need to memorize those 5, and you're going to need to be able to apply them to a novel situation, which we're going to do in class. It's part of these slides, but we're going to do that in class. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go forward. All right, I have a little bit more to talk to you guys about, so let's just kind of keep pressing on so that I don't have 2 videos here. And let's move into what is another thing that historians look at and starts really with civilizations is understanding of changes over time. One of the themes in history is looking at how things change and adapt over a certain time period. Remember, historians are always looking for causes of things, right? What caused this? So we can look at changes and see little things that pop up and cause those changes to happen. So first off, these early civilizations were extremely reliant on their environment. Something like a natural disaster, or if a resource gets wiped out in an area, that could cause major effects to that civilization. They could collapse, right? Something as big like a volcano or an earthquake could destroy an entire civilization. And depending on where they were in their history, we might not know about them, right? One of the cool things about studying the ancient world is you never know if there's going to be a new discovery of a civilization. We're going to talk about in this class, not for a little bit, but we're going to talk about in this class civilizations that we didn't know existed, that we thought were maybe mythical. But turns out that as people started studying and making connections, they found evidence of these kind of ancient societies that just disappeared because of a natural disaster, right? So very reliant on the environment. As much as humans were changing the environment to farm, things could happen. There could be a drought, a serious drought that wipes out a whole civilization. There could be downstream effects. If 2 different civilizations are using the same river and they start diverting the water away, that could cause major effects for the people downstream, right? So environment is a huge player in the ancient world. Another big player is something that we call cultural diffusion. Okay, cultural diffusion is the spread of ideas, customs, and technologies from one culture to another. In other words, it is just spreading culture. So when one civilization or part of the world learns a new technology, right? They start using, say, bronze instead of stone. That knowledge of how to work with bronze, of how to make bronze tools, which are better and more durable, and they don't break as easy, and they last a long time, right? As these tools start being learned, as those technologies start being learned, they spread, and they spread out through trade, through war, through just migration as people are moving around. So these ideas, right? These ideas spread. Cultural diffusion is one of the big themes of this class, guys. One of the biggest themes of this class, that we're going to talk about how culture spreads, because that is what always bring up. We're world history and cultures, right? This is what we're studying. But it is that spread of culture that really shows the interconnectedness of the ancient world. So you need to know what cultural diffusion is. Okay, you need to know cultural diffusion. And then finally, one of the things that we're going to talk about is the difference between city states and empires. Some civilizations exist as city states, as each city is essentially its own country, but they have a shared culture among each other. So I think of like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, or Philadelphia and New York. Right? If you thought of like if Philadelphia was its own country, right? We have our own laws, right, that are passed by city council. Um, we have our own customs, right? We have the cheesesteak. We have football teams. We speak English. Um, and then if you look at Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh speaks English. They have a football team. They don't have cheesesteaks, but they put fries on their sandwiches, which is cool, I guess. But so they have their unique cultures, right? But generally speaking, things are very similar in Philly, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, LA, right? You name it, right? Culture's pretty similar, a little different, but pretty similar. That would be like an example of a city state where each city is its own kind of country, but that shared culture kind of ties them together. Some of the first civilizations we're going to talk about were city states or collections of city states. An empire, on the other hand, is when you have one central government, right? That rules over a large area of land. So empires typically are more diverse because they encompass larger territories, right? So again, not to keep using this example, but I think like if we're thinking empire, if you think of the United States, right? Yeah, there's a lot of similar culture, but also the climate in Alaska is very different than the climate in Hawaii, which are both parts of the United States. Customs and cultures in Texas is very different than custom and culture in Boston, right? People talk differently, act differently, are involved differently, think politically differently. Like there's all sorts of things that are different in an empire where you have one government that rules over a larger stretch of land. One's not necessarily better than the other. Both have had successes in the ancient world. There are still some city states around today. Vatican City is one. Um, Singapore is another. So you have, kind of this collection of city states and empires today, or what I guess you could call an empire. Um, but in the ancient world, it was the same thing that you had city states, you had empires, and we're going to talk about how both of them get formed and the positives and negatives of each as we start learning about them in more detail. Okay, guys, that's it for this section 3 video. We're going to talk more about those characteristics of civilization, so make sure that you are studying them and that you know what they are. And that's it. I will see you guys next time.